Okay, there's a few seats down here if you want to come down. Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. My name is Vin Ray. This session tonight is one of a series called Reflections, in which we ask prominent, eminent journalists to look back over their careers, to look at some seminal moments, some inspirations and some influences. And in doing so, we hope teach us something about the craft and the practice and the future of journalism. The way it works is that we ask each guest to select a range of clips that we can show you. And tonight's collection, I can promise you, is quite interesting, surprising, and eclectic. And then we'll talk around them a bit, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity at the end for some questions and answers. It's kind of conflation of This Is Your Life and Desert Island Discs, really.
This is your desert island.
This is your desert island too. Our guest this evening is the World Affairs editor of the BBC. I could spend the entire evening just introducing him and some of the things he's got up to. There are no awards that he hasn't won, and there are very few major stories of the past 40 years at which he hasn't been present. The thing I want to say, though, is that in broadcasting, there are some people who are good at short-form television news. Some people are really good at television documentaries for an hour long. Some people are good at straightforward radio news summaries. Some people can write essays for the Today programme. Some people can do radio documentaries or blogs. But this guy can switch effortlessly between all of them. He really is a consummate broadcaster, but not just a broadcaster, actually. Journalism is a very competitive business, and if some of John's colleagues are mildly annoyed that he is such a good writer, they're probably really pissed off that he sells so many books, actually, as he does. He has the ability, I think, to be in the right place at the right time in a way that no other British journalist does. He is, of course, and please welcome John Simpson. John, kick us off with, you're going to talk a lot about your thoughts about journalism tonight, but just to get us going, can you articulate the difference between a good journalist and a bad journalist in your view?
I don't know. I mean, I think I can tell you what I think a good journalist is. A good journalist is somebody who's just kind of interested in things. I don't know that it goes all that much beyond that interest, that desire to know what's going to happen around the next corner. That I mean, that's why journalism is not just sort of 5 or 6 top people and a host of others. It's something which very large numbers of people are very good at. The bad ones are the lazy ones, the ones that can't. I mean, I'm lazy, so that puts me in the right category. But the ones that don't really care, the ones that just sort of get through and get by and don't ask questions. The ones that can be pushed about, and I mean, we'll be hearing
What do you mean by that, John?
Well, that you can say, best not to go into that kind of area if you don't mind. And to a lot of journalists, that's a kind of invitation to go into that, whatever that may be. To get involved. There's obviously something, but there's obviously something of interest and the mere fact somehow, it's a sort of, I think good journalists are always kind of contrarians, that you've only got to say to them, I think it's best to, not touch on that, for them to want to touch on it. And it's the ones that just say, okay, fine, no problem, and who want to please the system that are the crap.
Yeah, and sometimes the system has a view of a story from base, which is different.
Absolutely, and I mean the system. It doesn't have to be the Soviet Union. It doesn't have to be the evil empire. It can be, system can be the BBC. I've got a wonderful editor nowadays. I mean, a lady who's in charge of me, and I just love the look on her face that when I come up with things that I feel we ought to be doing, and there's a sort of oh God, and then. But because she herself is a good journalist, you can see her working it through in her mind and thinking, yeah, that is good. And then she thinks, I'm going to have terrible trouble somewhere down the line, but it's worth it. And I do think that the good journalists, and we'll see some superlative ones, I hope, during this evening, they're always the ones that, just think it's worth kicking over the traces, and not being quiet and obedient and nice, and going home and getting honours and everything at the end of it.
You wrote this book, Unreliable Sources, recently, which was how the 20th century was reported. Did you feel you learnt anything from that about journalists?
Yeah, well, actually the main thing I learned from it, in a way, was that journalism is a kind of, I was going to say static, but that's a kind of negative word, but that you can go back to 1900, you can go back to 1856, and you can find people there that you think, yes, that's exactly the kind of journalist that I know now, and that I like now, and that I admire now. And they've all got that sort of sense of wanting to push the boundaries, wanting to be, not just wanting to do what the bosses want them to do, right the way through, from William Howard Russell, who was the first proper war correspondent and reported on the Crimean War, and had a terrible time from the generals until he started giving the generals such a bad time themselves that they felt they'd got to watch out for him, and let him do the kind of reporting that he actually wanted to do. And I always feel with a man like William Howard Russell, and there's loads of others whose names are less well known, you could just bring him in here into the bar downstairs, and you could say to him, you give him 10 minutes to update him. There's a thing called the internet, and the Germans were a bit of a difficulty a couple of times during the century, and there were communists and stuff. You just kind of give them a quick look at what's happened, and then you could say, okay, well, I think you're fine to go out and do a report for ITN or the BBC or something like that, and he'd do it absolutely, beautifully, because it's not. It's an instinct. It's a way of seeing the world. It's not just a kind of. It's not like being a carpenter or something like that. It's something which doesn't change. Well, maybe carpentry. I'm not a great expert on carpentry, I have to say, but it's something that doesn't change from decade to decade, century to century, I think.
Okay.
It's a mental mindset. It's a mindset.
Yeah. Okay, let's go right back in time, John. And do you want to introduce your first clip?
Yes. Well, I am, my wife, who's mildly younger than me, always gets irritated when I harp on about how old I am. But I'm 68 years old, and I was born and brought up and started work for the BBC. I'm afraid I've only ever worked for the BBC. It's a bit like living with your parents, when you're in your 50s, you think, you have to say, it's really convenient or something like that. No, it's been convenient to work for the BBC. But I want to just give you it's actually rather an over-dramatic, well, I think certainly very dramatic, but possibly over-dramatic sense of how the world seemed to a 15-year-old, 16-year-old. I can't remember how old I was when I first read 1984, because the world then, that would have been in the 50s, I suppose, late 50s, early 60s, late 50s, seemed a very different place from what it was now. We know that liberal democracy has triumphed over its opponents. At the time, there was no certainty that that would happen at all, and we felt, or at least I as a kid, I felt really kind of nervous about what was going to happen, and would the Russians, would the, all these other kind of unpleasant outfits triumph over us, and it didn't seem very likely that we would triumph over them. So this is an extract from 1980, the film of 1984, it rather illustrative of that dreadful line in the book, which says, if you want to think of whatever it is, if you want to have an idea of the future, think of a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You were once curious about room 101. It is not one room, but many. This one, for instance. You're going to find out what lies beyond that door, Winston. But to whet your curiosity, I will give you a hint. In room 101 is the worst thing in the world. Of course, that varies from individual to individual. It may be burial alive, or death by drowning, or by fire, or by impalement, or 50 other deaths. Which death do you fear most in all the world, Winston? You needn't answer. You've already told me.
A rat. A rat. It's gone now.
Never seen you like this.
This is the one thing I really hate. The one thing I'm really afraid of.
Why?
When I was a child, where I lived, there were swarms of them. One day, my sister.
Will you lead the way, Winston?
Not to me. Not to me. To Julia, not to me. I don't care what you do to her. Let her suffer. Not to me. To Julia. Not to me.
Now, Winston, you are wholly ours. You have been washed clean.
Well, there you are. I mean, nowadays, Room 101 is kind of comedy shit, isn't it? And, I think that is the difference between 50 years ago and now, that these things, something like that was happening in perhaps dozens of countries around the world.
What's the nearest you've experienced, John, to 1984?
Well, do you mean being dragged into a prison?
Well,
I mean, I've had.
I don't mean you. I mean, which country you visited most?
Was that happening? Well, I mean, Idi Amin's Uganda, where life was so cheap that it was meaningless. Rwanda, when people were being murdered in the streets simply for by their neighbours for who they were and so forth. Sarajevo, where people were dying on a kind of daily, hourly basis, just simply for being citizens of the town. And nowadays, yes, there are nasty things that are happening, but it's it's a lot. I mean, there's a lot less of that kind of thing going on.
To the young journalists here tonight, what would you recommend they read for a career in journalism?
Oh God. Well, I mean, there isn't any better book, but then everybody knows it, than Scoop, which is just, so disturbingly accurate about journalism in 2013, just as it was about journalism in 1930 or whenever it was written. It's I don't know. I don't think there is a book. I think it's an experience. And I have to say, though, a friend of mine years and years ago, but it's still true, said to me, somebody said something about, it's got real journalistic qualities, and this friend mine said, have you noticed that journalistic is only regarded as a term of praise by journalists? For everybody else, it's a real insult. I mean, academics attack each other by saying, this book is really little more than a journalistic exercise. But we, however, regard it as a high term of praise and credibility. So I don't know. I don't think you can read about it. I think you can, but there's certainly Scoop, and there's also a marvelous book by Michael Frayn. I don't know if anybody here has written about it, read it. I mean, which is about Scoop is about reporters, and Michael Frayn's book Towards the End of the Morning is about sub-editors. I was a sub-editor, and it meant everything to me to read this book, and it's also very funny.
So you were a teenager reading 1984. At what point did you decide you wanted to become a journalist? Were you at university at this point?
Well, I don't know. I know I did quite a lot of journalism earlier than that, because I just liked writing, that was all. And I liked the business of sort of seeing things and then making an account of it. But the thing is, I don't want to sound too high-minded, but what 1984 did, the thing that really frightened me was not Room 101 or the rest of it, or the bit where poor old Winston gets his brain blown away. That wasn't the thing that frightened me. The really frightening thing seemed to me at the age of 14, 15, whatever, that the state could destroy the memory of what had happened, that it could change history and make it impossible for anybody else to check it out. And I mean, this, of course, happened both in the Soviet Union under Stalin and in China under Mao, that you couldn't. The records themselves were gone through and checked, and everything in them that didn't support whatever the current orthodoxy might be, that those things would be taken out, weeded out, and you wouldn't ever be able to find out what had really happened. That scared me. I now realize that actually it was never on. I mean, and it's not just because liberal democracy won the Cold War or something like that. Even in Soviet Russia, when I finally got there and started spending lots and lots of time there, I realized there were loads of people who really did understand what had happened and weren't prepared to forget it, even though they weren't allowed to say it in public necessarily. And of course, as life continued and the system started to wind down, they became able to talk about it again. And the same thing is happening now in China. Very, very, very exciting. So, it was an adolescent fear which very much fed by reading books like 1984, which didn't actually come to pass. I mean, fear of something which didn't come to pass.
Okay, can we put the next still up? It's
Am I talking too much?
No,
tell me.
That's why you're here, John, actually.
Is it?
Talk, yeah.
Is it? Is that why I'm here?
It's not long since England had won the World Cup. and a young journalist turned up at Broadcasting House. And John has even got the headlines from the day that he started at the BBC, and these are they.
It was a very weird place. I mean, it does look weird, doesn't it? Now, I think now this new building that we have, at new, what they call New Broadcasting House, is it's like, you know, it's like kind of new capital for an emergent nation, isn't it? I think it's superb. Actually. I never thought I would ever hear myself saying that anything the BBC did, or especially planned, could be superb. But the building itself, perhaps because it wasn't designed by anybody from the BBC itself, is absolutely wonderful. And for me to go back there, which I did in, I think I sort of first set foot back there in July of this last year, and I've even got a desk there, and it's wonderful. At this time, I mean, it was honoured in a way that I hadn't really kind of seen anything being honoured before. People believed the BBC, bless them, and I was one of them. I've got a little incident which will show you what changed my view in a moment or two. But I arrived there on the 1st of September 1966, slightly late, wouldn't you know it? You know, this is the rest of my life, my career, etc. I was 15 minutes late in getting there. I'd got the wrong bus or something. And it was all full of people in sports jackets with leather patches. There were a few women, very, very few women. And the first thing that first sort of substantial thing that anybody told me on the 1st of September was, you've got to get out of this place as quickly as you possibly can. And he said, because this was the headquarters of radio, he said to me, got to get into television, because in 10, 15, 20 years' time, radio won't even exist, and television will be the only thing. I would like to do it myself, he said, but I'm too old. I've lost the chance. He was probably about 33 or something, you know. And so I wandered into this place, which is actually in terms of today's newsroom, which is sort of enormous, disgustingly enormous. It was, I suppose, rather tiny, really, and lots of people in jumpers and cardigans that kind of buttoned up the front, which actually my wife tells me are now in full fashion again, but I couldn't bring myself to buy one or wear one. Labouring away, writing this stuff, and the bastards in charge were like kind of slave drivers criticising those younger than themselves. I had the most appalling time, but I sat there at 1 o'clock on the 1st of September. It was a Wednesday, I think, and I listened to the headline. You had to sit around as though the Oracle was speaking, and this was the 1 o'clock news. The radio people, bless them, thought that they were still, the key to everything, as they had been during the war. And I later found that, and there was a phone that connected you to Television Centre newsroom, and every morning the editor of Radio News got through to his counterpart at Television News and told him what Radio News was going to be doing. We thought at Radio News that they were waiting for this to know what they should do. I found when I went to television, they regarded this as a really stupid waste of time, and they put the most junior person on to taking the call. That was how things were. And these were the headlines. It's now feared that 90 people, probably all British, died in the Britannia airline crash in Yugoslavia. The cabinet, I think this is a really significant one. The cabinet, at its first meeting for 3 weeks, has discussed Rhodesia and the economic situation, i.e., nobody knew anything about what had been talked about. It was just, you were allowed to know the subject, and that's it. It's not for you, little man, to know what the cabinet has been talking about. President Angola said the Americans must withdraw from Vietnam before there can be a settlement. But he got that one wrong. Hundreds of police officers from all over London lined the funeral route this morning at the service for their 3 murdered colleagues. This was an almost unthinkable crime that had happened, I think, in July, when 3 cops had been murdered by some ghastly character who was arrested quite soon afterwards. Later in the programme, I don't know what the programme was. They didn't have The World at One then, although that's been going on for a hell of a long time, almost as long as I have. Later in the programme, Sir Alec Douglas Hume will be talking about Harold Macmillan's memoirs. How nice, how lovely. And that was it. We listened to that and all felt as though the oracle had indeed spoken. I was a useless sub-editor. I was absolutely crap at it, and I would get things wrong all the time, and I hated it. Whether I hated it because I wasn't any good at it, whether I wasn't any good at it because I hated it, whether the two things just ran along parallel lines, which I suspect. But there was a tremendous thing. Everybody in that newsroom, it seemed to me, with the exception of about 4 or 5 really nice people, felt it necessary at some stage to come over to me and explain why a degree from Cambridge University was actually a real handicap for a good journalist, and how only standing in the rain in Barnsley or something, taking notes about who comes to a funeral, was the proper way to become a journalist. Actually, as the years passed, I rather agreed with that, really. But, I didn't like being told it by these dreadful kind of blokes with, lots of dandruff in their hair.
Did the act of subbing, did you learn anything about writing doing it? Or
No, are you kidding?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it drove out.
Come on, get off the fence. No.
Yeah, it drove out any kind of creativity or interest, because it kind of limited everything. It boiled it all down to to a kind of formulaic pattern. Everything had to have a pattern to it, and if it didn't, some arsehole with a 6B pencil would cross it. You see, I really feel very strongly about this. I mean, all these years later, because it was a nasty...
The formula.
Nasty old experiment. Yeah, and it was. And if you showed... I mean, I remember one of the things that they... at first, all they would let me loose on, when I say at first, or about the first year, was the weather. And so sometimes they would say, I'd say, the forecasters say that the next few days will be cold and damp, something. And then one of these 6B pencils would rip through that. How can you... a lot of them seem to be Scottish. I mean, forgive me, this is not a thing against Scotland. It's just a thing about old, horrible Scottish editors. How do you know they're saying this, Sonny? How do you know? Did you hear them say it? Well, no, actually, I didn't, Mac. But that's what they be. That's what they be. How do you know that's? But and then he crosses it out and he says, the forecast for the next few days is, and then so the next day you'd think, okay, well, so I'd write the forecast for that. No, laddie, be somebody else, another Scotsman. No, laddie, what are you talking about? It's not. Where's your imagination? No, say something really kind of better, like the forecasters say that the next few days. And I just thought, oh God, I escaped from there after 15 months. I remember the time, and it was like digging a tunnel out of Stalag Luft 7, and I never, and years afterwards, years and years, because I worked at that place, although I was a foreign correspondent quite quickly, but I was sort of kind of bossed about from Broadcasting House, and I would have to go back to it from time to time. For years and years afterwards, I would, when I had to see somebody in the news department, that was all the 3rd floor of the old BH, I'd go up to the 4th floor and walk along, so thus missing the newsroom, and then come down and come into the offices. And I used to think this was quicker. And it took me a long time before I realized, having read the works of Carl Jung, that I was actually just trying to escape from my past. I hated it.
Do you want to introduce this next bit of I need to warn you, this is a mute piece of film. But why don't you just say what it is, John, and then we'll talk about it.
Yes, well, yeah. It's, I think, I haven't actually seen it, but I think it's about the Americans bombing a village or something. It's a protest.
Yeah,
you tell me,
so, yeah.
Protest. I was a sub-editor at a time when the Americans were very heavily occupied in Vietnam, as indeed they would be for the following 10 years, and they were always bombing friendly villages. Little did I realize that decades later I would be in northern Iraq in 2003 and the invasion of northern Iraq, when I would myself be with a group of friendly people who were bombed by the American Air Force. Some things do not change in history, and but this was a kind of what is it? It's a bit of stuff out of a news report.
Yeah.
And it's mute, is it?
Yeah. So you can carry
Well,
on
that's
talking.
useful. We ran a lot of... One of the problems about television news at this point was that everything was 24 hours old. And one of the arts of being a television sub-editor, as opposed to being a radio sub-editor, was you had to kind of pretend that the stuff that you'd got overnight from, say, Vietnam was today. It was illustrating today's news. But since the Americans bombed villages on a daily basis, it didn't really matter too much. Now the thing was, I was a sub, and there was a village that had been bombed, and I had to write a story about it. And the village, slightly unfortunately, was called Phuoc Me, which I thought probably was what the villagers felt when they saw the bomb coming over. So I wrote it down, and the newsreaders then, I'm not even sure they were called, I think they were called news announcers, were incredibly grand characters who had won the war for Britain, and they'd been the voices. Broadcasting house was bombed while they were on the air, and they'd stuck to it, and they were, I'm not mocking them. They were very grand. But by 1966, 1967, they were on the elderly side and didn't see the point of the modern world very much. And so one of them, famous old one, whose name I won't give because his descendants will undoubtedly be in the audience, lots of them, read this in a terribly, frightfully plummy voice. He threw down the paper and said, "This is outrageous. I cannot be expected to read filth like this." So, it attracted, of course, a certain amount of attention. People crowded round to know what the filth was. And the filth was the name of the village, Phuoc Me. So I remember we had a conference. I'd never been at an editorial conference before. I was probably still 22. And, most of the others were kind of variants of my age times 4 or 5. And they all gathered round, and I was at fault. Clearly everybody, I was sort of in the dock, why did you write this? And so I said, I'm sorry, but that is actually the name of the village. It's on the map, I said. I hadn't actually looked at the map, but I assumed it would be. And indeed, there it was, Phuoc Me. And, well, actually, we got out of it because the news editor said, well, let's just call it by the name of the next door village. So that was... And then I realized that form and content were more important necessarily than accuracy, which was irritating. We did try to pronounce it in different ways, but it wasn't convincing.
A lot of people here won't realise, John, that your route to being a foreign correspondent passed through being political editor and at one point presenter of the main evening news, actually.
I was actually a foreign correspondent for 15 years before that. But yes, it did. I had a row with my boss, and I said, I'll take the first decent job that comes up. within the BBC. And the first decent job that came up was being political editor, 1980. Fantastic time. Margaret Thatcher just coming in, just starting the business of carrying out her revolution. Fascinating. I mean, I've never regretted being so close to politics, and I love that aspect of it. But you couldn't. I don't know. It was very. You were shackled. I mean, you were utterly shackled. The BBC had to be so careful, I suppose, that it didn't feel able to report on things. And I was the manager. I was 33 something. Can't think. No, older than that. 36. I was 36, and every single one of the 8, 10, 15, however many there were, I couldn't even count them, correspondents that came under me was older than I was and far more experienced. All my experience had been in foreign news, and I was pitchforked in, I didn't enjoy it. I didn't have a nice time. I loved the work, but I didn't like, and I couldn't bear the old lobby system which you had, where you weren't allowed to say who told you this, gave you this information. There's going to be an election. How do we know? Sorry, can't say. In fact, of course, it was the Prime Minister's press secretary who would say to you, John, you might like to know we're going to have an election. And you'd say, oh, that's... Well, we had actually, I have to say, when there was a brief party which finally merged with the Liberals to become the Liberal Democrats. It was called the SDP, the Social Democratic Party. David Owen, if anybody remembers him, was one of the founders. And we missed the story. And the papers were all full of it the next morning. And I called these unwilling people together. Very comfortable lives they led. They didn't want to be shoved out of their comfort zone. And I said, how the bloody hell did we miss this story? Did anybody know about it? And one of the correspondents said, oh yes, well, David Owen did actually tell me, but he asked me to keep it quiet. And so we missed that. I couldn't take it anymore. But the thing is that having been a foreign correspondent for 15 years, I was kind of I wanted to be on my own. I didn't like all this sort of mass journalism, the sort of organized sort of form of it all, where everybody did everything, everybody knew everything. I like to compete with my colleagues as well as my doesn't show me in a very good light, but I didn't like sharing information and stuff, and I realized it wasn't for me. The lobby system was horrible. Now it's been entirely reformed, and all the things one hoped would happen now have. And I mean, you can say anything you want, and you can, it's fine. But in those days, it was very, very controlled and horrible.
Do you think it's easier being a foreign correspondent than a domestic correspondent?
Oh, yes, far easier.
Some of your colleagues have said to me in the past, you can actually get away with generalisations in foreign news that you couldn't possibly make at home.
Yes. No, that is true, and it's fun. It's more fun, and you can get on a bus or a train or a horse, and you can go somewhere, and you can find things out. If you're in London or something, the most you're going to do is to go down to Westminster on the tube.
What happened to your presentation career on the 9 o'clock?
Well, it was pretty crap, actually. I finally got out of being political editor by lobbying very hard to be one of the two new readers or presenters, I suppose we called ourselves, of what was then the 9 o'clock news. And John Humphreys was the other one, and he and I were very, very close, very friendly. But there was a lot of internal politics. The Director General was furious of the day. Poor Alistair Milne, who died just the other day. Quite an embittered man, sadly. I'm sorry to say, because he was a very able and very charming man in many ways. but he had his knife into the editor of the of television news, and in the end they demanded that the whole experiment of having journalists reporting the news as opposed to former actors, actually rather grand-looking actors, very charming. Another one of whom died, Kenneth Kendall, died just recently. Terribly good, wonderful accent, all that stuff. But I mean, wouldn't know Vietnam from Vientiane, which I'm not sure I know terribly well. But if you pushed him, and so the notion was that Humphreys and I knew what we were talking about. It was a rather feeble imitation of what had happened in ITN, decade before, and I wasn't that good at it. Actually, Humphreys wasn't that good at it, as I'm forced to remind him every now and then. But and I got the boot in amazingly sort of awful circumstances, smuggled out of the building with a coat over my head, virtually like a child molester, of whom, of course, had we only realised that there were several actually in the building, and probably at work as it happened to me.
Yes.
And I was sent. It was the Falklands War. It was never clear to me, actually. But Margaret Thatcher herself put in a huge complaint about something I did on the 9 o'clock news 3 days earlier, when I did a report about how Britain's diplomatic efforts had convinced the Argentines that we weren't interested in holding on to the islands. And Thatcher apparently exploded in a shower of sparks when she saw this. And she certainly rang up the DG and complained and demanded that I should be moved up. Well, I don't know whether that was what caused it or not. Of course, I mean, it's kind of, it suits my amour propre to suggest that it was because of my high principles that I was chucked out. Actually, it was also clearly true. I was a crap newsreader, so
Okay, do you want to introduce the next clip?
Yes. The next one is when I was a sub, I seem to have spent huge amounts of time talking about the 15 months when I was a sub-editor, but it did mark my time quite a bit. I wanted to be a reporter. I always wanted to be a reporter. And in the sort of cardiac arrest system of the BBC, that wasn't permissible at that stage. I'm not sure it would be now if some young character came and said he wanted to be a reporter. But I was fortunate enough to have links with a very lovely newspaper, which sadly now doesn't publish in print anymore, but is to be found on the web and is excellent still, I think, the Christian Science Monitor. And I went round to see them before this incident occurred and said, would they like me to do some reporting on it? And it was the second of the two really fierce anti-Vietnam demonstrations in Grosvenor Square outside the American Embassy in 1968, and I reported on it for the Christian Science Monitor, not for the BBC, and I'm not sure the BBC actually got around to having anybody there.
Okay. Let's pull through to it then. The next one.
Did I miss one out?
Don't worry.
Oh yeah, I did.
It's going. The police are being pushed backwards. The police are just holding, but they can't hold any more. Well, I've just broken through the police lines. The column has just come down the road there. Unfortunately, I've just been hit in the face. There's several smoke bombs. They're through. The first are through now. The first are through. They're in. The horses are in now. And they must... A horse also tried it. They're screaming now, absolutely hysteria.
Well, it was tremendous stuff, and it was, and you know, you never know, do you, whether you're going to be able to kind of put up with this kind of thing. I was there with a photographer who, at one key moment, decided that it was time to leave. Can I have the photographs? You know, oh, I haven't actually taken any yet, he said. And, you know, it's, there are people that can put up with stuff like that, and there are people that can't. No criticism of the ones that can't. It's just a kind of, I think, in the case of people like me, it's a sort of an insensitivity to other people's suffering that makes you prepared to do it. And so from that moment, I realized that actually what I needed to be was a reporter. And I really, really, really never stopped until about 18 months later. I nagged my way into being a reporter, a very junior reporter. I was actually, although this is a boring story I've told 150,000 times, I was actually punched by Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, on my first day as a reporter. Slightly awkward. And he said he was going to report me my appalling behaviour to the Director General. I'd asked him whether he was going to call an election. Terrible. I mean, you can see why he'd want to punch me. But these things happened in those days, and it was a different world. The bit that I was going to, but I think it's kind of the time has passed really, but was going to show you was Costa Gavros's film Z, about a political prisoner in Greece. Wonderful film. I really recommend. You don't see it much nowadays, but I really, really recommend it. Absolutely superb, and it kind of fixed me. Although I when I look back at my career, I realise I haven't done nearly as much human rights reporting as I would like to do. I mean, that I feel is a sort of kind of essence of being a reporter, but it gave me a real sense just watching that. Tears, I have to say, running down my face, and I thought all that matters is supporting people like that and revealing what happens. Well, you know, that isn't all I've done. I've done a little bit of it, but not as much as I'd like.
How do you talk a little bit about impartiality, John? I mean, you're the most senior journalist in the BBC. You're making judgment calls quite a lot in your reports. You talk about your passion for human rights. When you do a story, you are being selective in choosing the story in the first place, and which aspects of the story you show. How do you go about doing that and separate your personal opinion and your, if you like, professional judgment, as it were?
Well, I think after 46 years of doing it, I think you can. I don't think it's very difficult to work out what your own views are and make sure that you don't present them. That you're not guided solely by your own views. That there is, I really honestly believe there is such a thing as objectivity, and I think if you can make yourself as objective as possible, you will be able to look at these things and say to yourself, I've veered much too strongly here into my own opinions of what this is. But I have to say to you that my first Director General, the first one I served under, was Sir Hugh Green, who was Graham Greene's brother, and was pushed out by Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister for introducing programs like That Was the Week That Was, and various other things which made fun of politics and so forth. And he was regarded as a kind of a dangerous liberal by a Labour Prime Minister. That he was tearing down the fabric of British society, and that the BBC played its part in this. And I, of course, as almost the most junior person in the entire operation, scarcely ever saw him. But I did see him once when he gave a talk, and I can't think now why he was doing it, but he talked about South Africa, which was a place where I, not very long afterwards, found myself the BBC correspondent, so these things became really kind of significant in my own life. And he said, of course, objectivity is the central quality about reporting. But he said that's not the same thing as balancing two opposites and regarding them as having equal validity. Balancing, for instance, fascism in one scale, and liberal democracy in another. We are not, and he said, we are not objective but no, he didn't say objective. We're not. Oh God, I can't really remember the word. But we're not unbiased. Perhaps he said. I forget. I'll need to look it up. We're not unbiased as between apartheid and its effects. And I've never forgotten that. No BBC Director General has ever countermanded that. Mostly, no doubt, because they didn't know he'd said it. But as far as I'm concerned, there are principles which you do not simply accept to be kind of little local problems. If governments shoot their citizens down, if governments stamp on their faces, as it were, with a boot, if they lock up large numbers of people for saying the things they say, sometimes not very palatable things that you or I might not like to hear said, if they do that, then I think you have a duty to tell people about that. Actually, it's bloody easy, because you just simply allow these people to talk for themselves. And I was, as I say, the correspondent in South Africa at the height of apartheid, at the time in between the end of 76 and 78, when the Soweto uprising was going. You didn't need to add a single bloody adjective. You just quoted the people who were in charge of these things, the ministers, the police chiefs, and you just allowed them to talk for themselves. And that, as far as I was concerned, sorted out the argument.
Okay. Would you like to introduce Charles?
Yes. I've been fortunate enough in my lifetime to have been very close to a number of absolutely superb journalists, and the first of them was Charles Wheeler, a man who I always used to think didn't think as highly of me as I did of him, but then I think that was another example of his good judgment. He was a man who was able to cut through the nonsense and point out to you, as the viewer or the listener, with enormous clarity, just simply what was going on. And he could do that in all sorts of places, including this, where he's objective.
They talk about police brutality in these terms. They push us around. They arrest us for nothing. They call us niggers. They say we stink. They insult our women. We've had this for years, as long as we can remember. And the point simply came when somebody decided he wouldn't take it anymore.
During the day, the Watts district is quiet. I toured it before curfew time, found buildings still burning, the main shopping street, a scene of almost complete destruction, pavements impassable because of the rubble, and only soldiers on the streets. In 1/4 mile stretch of shops, 37 buildings have been completely destroyed. The rest can probably be rebuilt. A few buildings were not touched. These are Negro-owned and have hastily scored signs on them saying, owned by Blood Brother. Apart from journalists, who on the whole are being accepted by the Negroes now that comparative calm is restored, white men are still keeping clear of Watts. At one intersection there's a sign saying, turn left or get shot.
I mean, he did even greater reports than that when he was older than me, which takes some doing, in Iraq in 1990 and 1991. There was one point when, for Newsnight, he discovered that doctors in Kuwait were involved in torturing particularly Palestinians who had supported Saddam Hussein. And he went and he kicked his way into the operating theatre, which some of these doctors were using as a torture chamber. And I thought Charles Wheeler was absolutely the greatest. I shared an office with him for 3 years, which was a wonderful experience, just to watch how he did these things. But it was really just the liveliness of his mind, the interest that he showed, always. You couldn't talk to him about anything that he didn't immediately show an interest in. He'd never just sort of say, yeah, well, that's fine. You'll find out a bit later on in life, that this, that, and the other. He was never like that, and always had the liveliest of minds. And I've often thought that was really the quality that I think made him absolutely the best. But he wasn't the only one. Brian Barron, for instance. I tell you, one of the things that I really love about the new broadcasting house, I know I sound like a kind of salesman for it, but one of the things that they've done is that there are all these little glassed off areas where you have conferences and meetings. I mean, do BBC people have meetings, and they're all named after people who've died or been killed working for the BBC. And there's a Charles Wheeler one he died. Brian Barron died, but there are plenty of others who were killed. And when I saw the Brian Barron one, I must say, tears came to my eyes that the outfit would just remember people. Brian Hanrahan, people that had served it very well for long years. But it's easy to just let them go when they pass away. And the idea that the BBC should remember them is just wonderful. So I like to go past the Brian Barron meeting room. How irritated he would be that it was a meeting room that his name is associated with. He and I was the BBC correspondent in Johannesburg, in South Africa, I mean. But I was working for radio. And in those days, we didn't have very many television foreign correspondents, but Brian was one of them, and he was based in Nairobi, and he used to come down every time there was a really good story in my neck of the woods. And at first, of course, I was a little bit irritable that he would come in and kind of take it over. But very, very quickly, I hope within a few days, I realized what a high quality man this was, and how he understood the craft so much of television journalism, and he and I became really quite close, and we used to work together. And in the bit that I'm just going to show you, it was during the Soweto uprising, the first one in the 70s, not the second one in the 80s, and I was driving a car with Brian, as I recall, sitting in the back. That's right. and the cameraman sitting on my left, being a left-hand drive country, and we were going through a crowd, a really angry crowd, who just saw our white skins, didn't know we were journalists. Actually, journalists were usually pretty much okay in Soweto as long as they knew who you were. And somebody just incredibly sort of easily lent out an arm as we were driving. I was driving rather quickly through this crowd, as you can imagine, just lent out his arm and kind of just almost dropped a rock through the windscreen, which hit me on the head and shoulder and smashed some stuff in the back of the car. I then, we'll see it in a second, but I then put my foot down on the accelerator in order to get out of there, and I could just hear Brian's voice saying something, but in the sort of all the adrenaline, I wasn't listening, and he was saying, "Stop, stop, 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 what the hell?" He said, "We've got to film it. We've got to film it." And that's what we did. I can't remember how much you see of the actual trouble, but you can see after.
So throughout the day, tension was gradually rising, and the police began to patrol Soweto more actively, seeking to disperse any build-up of crowds. Unlike last year, the bulk of their weapons were specially made for riot control. It became increasingly dangerous for any white driving through Soweto. Our car, travelling at high speed, was stoned by a crowd. One of 2 stones thrown at the car at almost point-blank range. That's a measure of the anti-white feeling in Soweto tonight. Not so much a political gesture as resentment at whites being here while Soweto mourns the hundreds who died last year. The fact that the car carried a sign indicating that we weren't police or special branch made no difference. Compared to last year, these daytime incidents were insignificant. Though the police showed restraint initially, there seemed no good reason for the later patrols through the housing estates in which tear gas was fired indiscriminately. The result could only be to either intimidate or antagonize the people. So tonight, Soweto could be set for further violence. Though there's been sporadic trouble in Soweto in the last few hours, it's been eclipsed in importance by a new pattern of terrorism. With 3 attempts to blow up railway lines this week, plus a machine gun attack in Johannesburg, the security forces face a serious challenge from blacks trained abroad in sabotage and then sent back to South Africa.
Well, I think that was pretty good, don't you? Yeah. I think. I don't think he was making value judgments or anything. He's just telling you what. You know, when he starts saying they're going around firing tear gas at random, he's given us the evidence.
These judgments about stopping and let's get out and film. These are really fine judgments, and you've had a whole series of escapades with these, John. The worst of which I think is probably the one in Kurdistan where you lost your translator. I mean, do you have any personal kind of policy when it comes to safety? Is there a way you approach these things? How do you make that judgment about what to do?
I do, but the thing is, it sounds so self-regarding. I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but one thing I've learned 2 things. I think only 2 things in my career. One is just to keep on going. Well, manifestly, I've done that. But the other thing is, when you're in these kind of situations, get in there. Just absolutely get in there, get closer to it. I mean, Vaughan Smith knows that that's the right way to do it. Sometimes, your colleagues aren't as enthusiastic and as willing as you may be. But what I feel about it is
you don't worry about putting your colleagues' lives at risk by getting in there, as it were.
Well, I mean, no. All right, no, I don't, because they're there to do a job. just as I am. I wouldn't let them, I really, really wouldn't let them go ahead of me or go to places where I'm not prepared to go. I would think that was the most disgusting way of behaving. But, you know, the only point of being in somewhere like that is to show people back home, around the world, what is really going on. The cameraman, the whoever else may be there, knows that, and that's why they're there. And it's a duty, which I think you don't abrogate. And I just think that you've got to get stuck in. And if you don't get stuck in, you don't get the pictures. If you don't get the pictures, you're not doing the job. If you're not doing the job, you're not telling people what is really, really happening. And, you know, nobody has to do this. You can be the arts correspondent. You can specialize. Nobody in the BBC. I mean, God, you know, as foreign editor of the BBC, I mean, sometimes it's really difficult to drag people out of the BBC's embrace to get to dangerous places. So many people coming up to them saying, "No, you don't need to go if you don't want to," and don't. You know, I mean, sometimes you really got to kind of grit your teeth and get out of the bloody place because they want you to. You know, they give you far too many chances, I think, to back out. But that's what I think. And the cameraman, the kind of cameraman that I work with are people that understand that. I wouldn't take anybody to anything that didn't understand the problem that was likely to be and wasn't prepared to do it. I wouldn't have any. I wouldn't look down on them. I wouldn't criticize them. Everybody's got a right to say this is a line beyond which I'm not going to go. But if you are there you're paid to do the job, you're paid to tell people what's happening, then you've got to do it.
Okay, would you like to introduce the third of these journalists?
Yes. This is not a BBC journalist. This is a woman who regarded BBC journalism and objectivity, which she called crap, with some distaste. Her name was Martha Gellhorn. I was fortunate enough to be invited to the Cheltenham Literary Festival one year when I'd just come back from Baghdad during the first Gulf War. And there on the platform were Martha Gellhorn, I think the greatest journalist of the 20th century, certainly the greatest war journalist of the 20th century. American, but lived in England from 1960 onwards. And the other person was Max Hastings, whom I've come to admire and like enormously over the years. But at that stage, I'd only met him a few times. I thought he was a prat. And not only that, Martha said something about war journalism, and Max, who was a very distinguished war journalist himself, said something about war correspondents do this and that. And I'm afraid, I just saw a way of smarming up to Martha, actually, by being nasty to poor Max. So I said, I can't bear this nonsense people talking about being war correspondents. It's far too self-regarding. You're a journalist, and if you're a journalist, you just do anything that comes up. If it's a war, you do it. If it's somebody, some of the theft of milk bottles off the doorstep, you do it. And Martha, who had treated me beforehand as though I was some kind of distasteful character, because she really did dislike the BBC and institutions in general, Martha then looked at me and said, "That man is now talking sense." I didn't like the way she said "now talking sense." And then she said to me afterwards, "Come and see me when you're in London." And I did, and I became very, very close to Martha, and I think actually, if I'm really honest, I think I regarded her as a sort of surrogate mother in many ways, although a less motherly person than dear Martha it would be difficult to find. And she was beautiful. She was at that stage in her late 80s. She died at 89, and she was still as beautiful then as she had been, I think, as she had been when she was in her 30s, 20s and 30s. She did she didn't like television very much. She didn't like anything that wasn't writing. She was a writer and a very, very good novelist. She had been married to Ernest Hemingway. It was a life-darkening experience, darling, she used to say. And I found a letter from him. He thought that she was in danger of being a better novelist than he was. So that was why he started disliking her. And she did a long interview with, who was it?
Jeremy Isaacs.
Jeremy Isaacs, yes. When? In the, must have been, when?
95.
95? Oh, so not very long before she died. In fact, she died in 98. And here's a bit of it, of what she said.
What was the hardest subject, do you think, that you had to write about?
I mean, in war, what was the worst one saw, hardest to write about? They weren't hard to write, because they were just reporting. You just wrote what you saw, what you heard. That wasn't very difficult. But I think that the worst of everything was Dachau. The concentration camp was much worse than anything I'd ever seen in war.
Why was that?
Because it was organized reduction of human beings to skeletal shapes. It was planned and repeated and steady cruelty. It was like torture, and this is an abomination, the worst abomination of man, just torture on a large scale. And then, of course, when I got there, they were all still there, the prisoners. And there were the piles of the dead, which were these naked yellow skeletons, just piled like wood, outside of the place where they burnt them. And the living were going around, they had typhus, and they were just sort of staggering around with faces that had seen too much, and gone through too much.
Are there horrors that it's impossible to describe?
Yes, I don't think I ever got that entirely across as it was, because it's also your own shock makes you perhaps less observant than you ought to be.
She was, she was I think the best journalist writing in the Second World War. And
why, John?
Oh, there's a technical reason. It's because she had these enormous numbers of pages to fill in Collier's magazine, so thousands of words she could write, and she didn't have to keep it all down to 2 minutes 45 and all that kind of stuff. And she was able, and she was a highly, highly intelligent woman, but she there was a real connection between the eyes and the typewriter, the fingers on the typewriter. I mean, she was able to turn what she saw into words in a way that not many of us are able to do. And always there, somehow or another, there's a fire burning, just as there was with Charles Wheeler, a sense that, the world's a wicked place, and it's her function in some way to tell people about it and describe the world to people. I feel that she was just the absolute best, and I mean, you know, I do feel that my career, which has lasted as long as hers, actually, now, almost as long as hers, has been spent in the shallows. She was in the deep, you know. I've seen a lot of horrible things, but I've not seen Dachau. I've not seen the American the depression in America, which was where she made her name writing about these things, and I think, you know, that I've had it terribly easy compared with what Martha saw and went through. But she had fun as well. She had great fun.
Can you talk a little bit, John, just briefly about being a generalist? I mean, you're a very experienced generalist, but you are flown into situations where there are existing BBC correspondents. I should say that when I was John's boss a long time ago, he used to call himself the dentist. He would go into Foreign Bureau, and it would be extremely painful, but very brief for the resident correspondents. It's a process called bigfooting in the industry.
Yes.
But I just wanted to ask, how do you, as a generalist, how do you assimilate yourself quickly about a country or a story?
Well, it's their longevity and long service is a real advantage. There aren't many places. In fact, I can't really think of anywhere nowadays that I go that I haven't been to again and again and again over decades. And you know, while of course somebody who is on the spot, particularly somebody who speaks the language, has great advantages. It's also a tremendous advantage to be able to say, well, you know, I was here 30 years ago.
Context.
Yeah. It's how it's changed, how it's different. I mean, I'm going off to Libya on Monday. I've been going to Libya on a fairly regular basis since 1978, when Gaddafi. In fact, I reported, although I didn't go there, but I reported on Gaddafi's coup for the BBC in 1969. Actually reported on it, not just wrote a little paragraph for Radio News, and have kind of watched the place ever since, seen how it's changed, met Gaddafi, I can't think how many times, 5, 6 times, seen him dozens of times. That gives you an advantage in going to a place which nothing else can. I mean, you can read about it, but it ain't the same as turning up there. And I mean, China's another place. I came back from China fairly recently. I've been back and back and back. I'm back. First time I went there, everybody was still wearing only one of two types of clothing. I mean, you either wore a Mao jacket in black or you wore it in brown. Actually, I think there was a dark blue sometimes. And that was it. Every man, woman and child wore the same clothing. And that doesn't half give you a different view of a place now where, you know, there's lots of money and people wear the latest Western fashions. And so, yes, I mean, I'm not popular among my colleagues, I'm sure. I don't think anybody likes to see me. Probably not just among my colleagues either. But I think they do know usually that I've kind of seen their place, the area of their expertise, under conditions that they can only have read in the cuttings about.
Okay, you'll have noticed we've got so far through the evening and we haven't seen anything of John's at all. Would you like to?
No, say no. I don't know. I didn't. You know, I mean, television news in particular is always a battle between time and low quality, and so, you know, the things you think, oh, you know, I'm sure that must have been marvelous, and you look back and you think, oh God, you know, how awful that was, how crappy it was. But there's one thing I did. It's not that I think it was a marvelous piece. It was just that it just was so wonderful to be there that you couldn't fail. And it was it's the hardest journey I think I've ever made in the northeastern part of Afghanistan, an area called Badakhshan, which is a very, very wild area indeed. It's vast, great mountains. I'm sure you must have been to Badakhshan. Have you been to Sarisang, the Lapis mountain? Oh, do say no. Ah, well, I went up to the top. Thank God I could say that. It's, it is pretty rough, isn't it? We set out with, I think, 4 Russian jeeps, which were the only vehicles that anybody could think would possibly make the journey. And we lost 3 of them along the way, and the 4th one we abandoned when we got there. We had to come back by horse, which took even longer. But there's only one place, lapis lazuli, it's that blue stuff that, it's in Tutankhamun's eyebrows, and it's on some people's cufflinks, and it's been everything. It's what they crushed to make the cerulean blues of medieval manuscripts, and it all the good stuff comes from one solitary mountain in Badakhshan, and has done for 6,000-7,000 years. And they dig it out in the most primitive way. And I managed to persuade the BBC to let me go there and film it. I couldn't think of a single news element in it. But when people saw the pictures, the quality of the pictures shot by Peter Juvenal, they all felt that it had been worthwhile. We had to press on despite the dark. For most of the way, the track was too narrow for us to be able to stop for the night. It was appallingly uncomfortable. And to our right was a precipice which went down 50 or 100 feet to the river at the bottom of the valley. After a brief, uneasy night by the roadside, we finished the last lap of the drive to Sarisang. Journey's end, the mountain of lapis lazuli. The rays of the rising sun made it seem like a revelation. The night shift had come to an end, and the miners were making their way down the mountainside, just as they have for 6,000 years, each carrying around 60 kilos of lapis on his back, the bag for the night. The overseers chivied them along with their sticks. This is some of the lapis which has been excavated overnight. The men are small-time dealers who've brought it direct from the miners. It's been accepted from time immemorial that the miners can pilfer some of the lapis they dig out. If anyone tried to stop this, there'd be trouble. The overseers, who are calling out the miners' names for payment, work for big dealers who lease the mine's output a month at a time. The old man's questioning the amount his night's work has been valued at. "You aren't paying me enough," he says. One of the other overseers says, "Give him some more." The difference is tiny, matter of a few pence. The mining village at Sarisang must always have looked like this, ever since the days when lapis was dug out for the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Ur and Babylon. Today, as in the past, it's solely composed of men. One story says the mine is female and would be jealous of the presence of women here. I've had some nice trips in my time. That's really, I think, one of the loveliest. And I'm not. I don't hold that up as any example of how to report. It's just the stuff, the picture. I had, this is nothing to do with the BBC at all, but in those days, I used to write a column for the Sunday Telegraph, I think it was then. And, that extraordinary shot where the sun's coming up and the rays come out. And I was sitting there at the bottom of the mountain after we'd been up into the mine and seen the whole thing, and I was writing my column for the Sunday Telegraph, which we had to then send by satellite phone to them. And I got into one of those kind of purple passages that are all too dangerous for journalists. And I said, it was the sun shining behind the morning, the early sun or something, shining out like the rays of like something about the crown of an emperor or something. And I thought, actually, that's real crap. And so I put, or the crest on a notepaper of a dodgy estate agent, and bastards cut that bit out, and so we just had the rays of the. You know, the one great thing about television is there isn't any chance for anybody to get at what you do and leave little bits out. Thank God. I'm so grateful to work for television as opposed to newspapers.
Okay, I will introduce this last piece with your blessing, John. This was described to me by Martin Bell and Jeremy Bowen as the best piece of television news they had ever seen. It's, I think, a couple of months after 9/11, the Americans went into Afghanistan with the hope of ridding it of the Taliban, and John was waiting on the outskirts of Kabul as the Northern Alliance approached, and there was a very tense moment knowing whether the Northern Alliance would go in or indeed whether the Taliban would flee the city. And this is John's report on the day.
It was just before dawn that the wild dash for Kabul developed. Thousands of soldiers intent on capturing the capital. It seemed to take no time at all to cover the 12 or so miles. As we drew nearer to Kabul, the grim evidence of battle. These were former supporters of the Northern Alliance who'd switched sides and joined the Taliban. No mercy for them. Then we saw they'd captured another man. The presence of our camera probably saved his life. He was paralyzed with terror. By now, there were no Taliban left to resist. Then came the critical moment. Would the Northern Alliance simply race on and pour into Kabul itself, even though they'd undertaken not to? The commander in charge was determined not to let it happen. He ordered the armoured vehicles to block the way. The great advance was stopped in its tracks. But Kabul lay temptingly close to us now. A small BBC team decided to head on into the city alone. We went on foot, so no one would think we were soldiers. We ploughed on down the hill. At this stage, there were only a few local people around us.
Well, this is it. We're walking into Kabul city. We don't seem to have any problems around us. There's only people that are friendly and are saying, chanting, I'm afraid, kill the Taliban. But as we understand it, as we walk in here, there aren't going to be that many Taliban anyway.
It was 7:53 a.m. local time. Kabul was a free city after 5 years of perhaps the most extreme religious system anywhere on earth. Under the Taliban, girls couldn't be educated. Men could be whipped for shaving. All music was banned. It was forbidden to play chess, to sing, to possess a picture of any living creature. No wonder they're happy. But there was an ugly price to be paid for so much repression. In the streets, in the ditches, foreign volunteers for the Taliban, especially Arabs and Pakistanis, ended up dead, lynched or shot. They were particularly loathed. In the surroundings of the Intercontinental Hotel in the center of Kabul, we caught sight of a group of Arab and Pakistani Taliban trying desperately to escape the vengeance of the people of Kabul. A group of soldiers is hunting them down. Another one's bringing up some grenades to flush them out. They're trapped inside this building. But some local people have caught one of the Taliban group. He's an Arab. They make him call the others to get them to come out and surrender. And eventually it works. They're brought out as prisoners. This man is a Pakistani. The Arab gets particularly brutal treatment. In the jeep, there are other Taliban prisoners. This one is an Arab, perhaps an Egyptian. The other two are Afghans. This is the end of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And with luck, the end of this country's links with international terrorism as well. We went to a house where an Arab member of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization lived and worked. The place had just been ransacked by an angry crowd. Inside, there were explosives on the floor in one room and anti-personnel mines in another. Elsewhere, there was a printing press. The notices on the wall here were all connected with Al-Qaeda, including a training certificate and an organizational chart. Recruits had obviously been taught here. Upstairs, we found all sorts of documents connected with explosives. For instance, this manual in English with handwritten notes in Arabic for blowing up bridges and buildings. There were all sorts of guides about timing mechanisms and booby traps. And if all that's finished now, so is the system which intruded so brutally in everyone's lives. Suddenly you don't have to wear a beard anymore if you don't want to. Shaving is a way of demonstrating your liberation. So is showing your face in public if you're a woman. And there's one thing more. Children can fly kites again. Freedom's in the air here. John Simpson, BBC News, Kabul.
Yeah, well, I didn't get that right, did I? I mean, it never occurred to me, I must say, that the Taliban would come back, that we would screw it up so royally and allow them back. Anyway, just shows.
Can I just ask, I mean, just from a purely craft point of view, the craft of television news, I've seen that piece very closely analysed, and the sentences are all incredibly short, and the language is amazingly simple. I mean, what advice would you give to young journalists starting out about writing, the craft of writing for television?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, don't go in for big effects. I mean, just make it as clear and as simple, and that tends to mean short sentences. I haven't seen that piece. I don't, and I wouldn't have shown it tonight, except that Vin persuaded me that I should. I find it quite painful, actually. This was a record of the biggest exclusive I've ever had. The world's press were outside Kabul, and they were a long way away from where we were, and we were close up to the front line because Vaughan's friend and colleague Peter Juvenal was working for us, and Peter had contacts, remarkable contacts with the Northern Alliance people, and got us down to a building that was really just on the front line, and we were able to stay there 25 miles closer to the action the whole time, and what was more, nobody else could really join us very much, because the Afghans themselves, the Northern Alliance themselves, wouldn't allow them to. In fact, Anthony Lloyd of the Times, who's a man I've got a great admiration for, highly intelligent and sensitive reporter. He managed to get there, and I was only too happy for him to stay with us in our in our house, in our building, and we knew when the attack was going to be. We went in with the first wave. The reason we were able to walk into Kabul was that Peter Juvenal had given supplied with a wooden leg or false leg, a prosthetic leg, the man who was in charge, the general who was in charge of getting us, of stopping people going in. And I just said to Peter, look, he can't say no to you. If you ask him, he's got to, I mean, he's an Afghan, he's got to say, yeah, okay. And indeed he did. And so we were inside Kabul as it was falling still, when most of the other journalists, in fact, I suspect, certainly most of the other journalists were still listening to our reports on the radio 25 miles back. But I made the silliest mistake. Well, I've made so many. I did an interview with the Today program, and from the roof of the Intercontinental Hotel, and the person at the other end, Sue McGregor, said to me, "I can't quite work this out. You say that the Taliban have vanished. You say that the Northern Alliance have stopped on the edge of the city and haven't gone into it. Who liberated it?" And I must never make a joke. It was so stupid. I mean, I said, well, I suppose it was the BBC. And this then got, I mean, I still get, when I do interviews with people, because they, all they do is just read the cuttings, and I still get this. Aren't you sorry that you claimed you had personally liberated Kabul? And you mustn't make a mistake with the British press. Wonderful outfit though it is, it has no corporate sense of humour, and in particular that absolutely loathsome character Piers Morgan, who hasn't yet had, it seems to me, the full meed of punishment for being Piers Morgan, had for some reason or another utterly taken against me. Well, that you can understand that. And I did a little bit before this, about a month, I think, or 3 weeks or something. I'd done a rather stupid stunt with Peter Juvenal of getting into Taliban territory and dressed as a woman in a burqa. Well, Peter was too. Actually, I thought I looked a lot more better really than Peter did. And he had such a dreadful coloured burqa. Mine was blue. Piers Morgan, for some reason, I don't know why, really took against this and ran a headline startlingly kind of aggressive and unpleasant. It said, "What a burqa." And then it said, that I'd been in there. And he picked up on this. Unfortunately, was listening back in London to this thing, and then started a thing about how I'd claimed to have single-handedly liberated Kabul and so forth. And it still comes up from time to time. Oh, that was getting on now. It's 12 years ago, and people do, even journalists somehow forget and can't, I suppose, find the relevant cuttings or can't be bothered to read through them all. So I'm hoping that by about 2023, when, if anybody ever interviews me again, they won't have found those particular cuttings and I'll be free of it. But I was really upset because this was such an intense group effort where the BBC had literally scooped the entire world at the one thing that everybody wanted to do, and because I said something stupid and didn't watch properly what I said, it then became just about me and how I boasted about it. And even now, I notice that people journalists, when they write about it, always say, the BBC, one of the first organisations to get into Kabul, because they somehow it's got into their minds, thanks to Piers Morgan and others, that there's a question mark over the whole thing. Well, anyway, you live and learn. I'm waiting for another good story like that, and I won't make a joke about it next time.
Okay, let's have some questions from the audience. If you could pick your hand up. There's two rules here. One is one question, please, and the other is, can you wait for the microphone? Who wants to go next?
Thank you. Hi. John, it's a question about personalities. You mentioned Gaddafi earlier, and I imagine that probably throughout your career you've met a lot of people who you might have found aggressive or distasteful, or at least perceived them to be like that beforehand. Has anybody sort of shattered your expectations and disarmed you when you've met them?
Actually, Gaddafi is rather an example. I mean, I don't know, really, I can't now remember what I thought about him before I first met him in 1978. But, I mean, he was doing unpleasant things to the opposition long before that, and I thought he was probably a nasty, vicious piece of work. Actually, I realised when I saw him, was a kind of sort of weirdo airhead who, for reasons which I never fully understood, nobody ever kind of brought to heel. Nobody said, you can't say that kind of thing in public, you can't do this kind of, these kind of... He abolished shops, for instance, once. There was nearly in the mid-70s. I mean, there really was in the early 80s, and there really was a famine. As a result, people starving because the goods and supplies didn't turn up. I mean, he did all sorts of sort of silly things. I don't think I've ever really found somebody that I thought was a monster who turned out to be actually really rather nice underneath it all. Having said that about Gaddafi, I mean, I thought, the manner of his death was absolutely disgusting, and I felt and feel really sorry for him. I mean, he was certainly a loony, but didn't deserve to die in that awful way that he did. Saddam, Saddam, actually, of all of them, I came to have a certain sympathy with Saddam. Awful though he was, and he was awful. I mean, the things that were done under his control were just people put into acid baths. I mean, I met a man, came across a man who'd been put into an acid bath because he'd written somebody's phone number on the only bit of paper he could find, which was a note, a bank note, and one of the figures had just slightly touched Saddam's portrait, and he was put in. Even the torturers, even the executioners, when he explained this to them, he said he told the BBC, and he didn't actually tell me, but he told the BBC in an interview, even they felt that this was a bit unreasonable, and so they said, okay, we'll tell you what we're doing, we won't kill you in the acid bath, we'll just dip you in quickly. And I mean, his injuries were just horrific, but he was alive. But Saddam was, he was kind of mensch, actually. He was a tough man with a real sense of humour, really nice to his grandchildren. I mean, okay, fine, I know I'm not making a very good case out, but he was interesting. But by and large, I mean, if you'll forgive me saying so, that arsehole quality always comes through. Robert Mugabe, for instance, I've interviewed him loads of times. I haven't now seen him for years because he won't speak to me. But he, he highly intelligent. I mean, the most intelligent man in the room when you're there, and it's generated a kind of arrogance and anger in him, because he just looks around, whether he's dealing with British diplomats or his own lot or the South African government. He knows he's 5 times cleverer than, or indeed me sitting there. He knows he's much cleverer than we are. It's not good for people to know that. But by and large, people who do nasty things are nasty people. That's what I have found, and haven't found many kind of gentle souls underneath the mask of the dictator.
Other questions? Yeah. Can you put your hand up if you want to ask a question?
When were you most afraid for your personal safety?
Well, I mean, you can't do the job without getting into trouble, and I've been afraid lots and lots. I'm really good about being afraid. I've had a lot of practice, and I do it. I can be afraid when there's nothing to be afraid of, But we were bombed by the Americans, and I've got no hearing in my left ear, and I got a whopping great piece of shrapnel in my backside, which doesn't half sound funny when you go through a metal detector at an airport. I think they must think there's some sort of strange piercing there, but it is in fact courtesy of the U.S. Air Force. I did some stupid stuff in Beirut when I started taking photographs at a rather tense moment, and I was grabbed, and the camera was chucked away, and I was made to kneel down and had a gun put to the back of my head, and they counted down and pulled the trigger, and it was all a big joke. So I got up and brushed my knees and tried to laugh and muttered the kind of rude words I thought they wouldn't know under my. The word wanker was less known in those days. But I mean then I thought that my last moment had come. It didn't occur to me. It was just they were just going to put me through a charade. I assumed, and I just remember thinking, I remember thinking I ought to be thinking about my then wife and children, but actually all I could think of was just this little patch of sand and dirt and earth with some gob on it and some cigarette ends, and I just remember thinking, I can't believe this is how it ends. But it didn't, so that was right. But and being shelled is horrible. There's a wonderful bit in Homage to Catalonia by Orwell where he says, I can't remember the words, but he says, that the shells seem to know where you are, and they say something like, I'm coming to get you, I'm coming to get you, and that is exactly what it's like. So often these things, actually when we were bombed by the Americans, it was all over by the time I could work out what had happened. 18 people dead, burned alive in front of us, including my dear translator. But I was knocked unconscious, didn't even know what it was for a bit. Had to have it explained to me by somebody else. So these things, when it's quick and it's when it's long drawn out that it's really scary and horrible.
Okay, questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, you talked about impartiality and objectivity, and as a journalist there are times when you think you're telling the truth and political correctness says no, you're not, you're being controversial. And an example of this is, for example, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And as journalists, we're not activists. We need to, it's our journalistic mission to, stay to the truth. But what are your feelings when people attack you for, being controversial when you're just trying to report the truth?
I just think your only defence. I mean, that of course the Israeli-Palestinian issue, if it's an issue, is something which is really, really difficult to deal with. I think you just have to know what's really going on, to talk to people as much as possible, everyone, to watch as much as you can of what is happening, and then just say what is going on. And that tells the story. You see, I always think about people that want to push a line, that they don't need to do it. They could save themselves a hell of a lot of effort by just simply saying what is going on. I mean, it's not always easy, but and it's of course hard to find out what is going on quite often. But if you're able to do that, assuming you're able to do that, then facts are facts. If somebody is whacking somebody else over the head with a truncheon, that's an unpleasant and uncomfortable fact, and nobody can deny it's happening. I just spent a holiday in South Africa, and I was reminded then of something. I was in Cape Town, and I went back to an area in the Cape Flats, which is a bit not a very nice area, where the government had pulled down a place in a whole sort of squatter camp in 1977 with great brutality, and we'd filmed the brutality. I mean, television is easier because you do, assuming you have the evidence, like Brian Barron showing somebody just at random shooting tear gas just in order to upset people. And I was going to be thrown out for this because the government of the day, the apartheid government, said I'd been lying about what had happened. And I knew I hadn't. I mean, I'd seen it. I mean, we had the evidence of the cameras. And in the end, I went to see the man in charge of the whole thing. And I said, you say I'm lying. Where's the lie? And he said, oh, well, you said that the buildings were bulldozed down, the shacks were bulldozed down. And he said, we didn't use bulldozers, we used front-end loaders. And actually, I laughed. I mean, I couldn't. And to do him credit, he wasn't a very nice man, but he started laughing too, and they didn't shut me out as a result. But, I mean, that's a very trivial little example and rather an elderly one. But if you can hand on heart say, I've been there and I've seen it, that is a position of such strength that nobody can shake it. But you've got to be there. Got to go there, and it's not always easy.
Okay, one last question. Anyone?
I think I've
exhausted them.
Exhausted everybody.
Let me ask you one last question, John. Has fatherhood, the second time around, as it were, changed your perspective about your job at all? Only in one sense. I've got a kid who's now 6. No, nearly. He'll be 7 tomorrow. God, how could I forget? And I love this kid. I mean, I love my 2 daughters too, but they are now rather sort of elegant young women, and this little boy is very reminiscent of the way that I saw things when I was his age, and yeah, I mean, I really dote on this kid. I don't want to get killed, and I want him to remember me, and I want him to remember me as a 99-year-old nuisance. I don't want to be, don't want to be just a sort of old fading photograph on the wall. But I just think there are other aspects of things, and I've done this job for decades, and I don't want to give up doing it. And my wife, who worked with me in South Africa as my producer in some pretty nasty places, understands that. And I don't know whether the kid understands it. I mean, we, of course, try and make light of things as best we can and just tell him that, there's nothing dangerous and so on. But, I mean, he's got a brain, and he can see some of the things that we all get mixed up in.
But I feel, I kind of worked it out in my own mind, that if he has any kind of liking or respect for me, which remains to be seen, it will be partly because of what I do for a living, and I don't want to stop doing it, because I think he may then, feel differently about me. Anyway, what else can I do? I'm not fitted to do. I can't be a solicitor at my age. I'm going to have to carry on while the BBC... And, of course, can I just say, do you remember on your last day in the BBC, I grabbed you in the afternoon and said to you, look, now you don't have any management responsibilities whatsoever. Do you remember? And I said, what does the management think about me and what I'm going to be doing and everything? And he said, Vin said, well, it's... No, there you are, getting on a bit. Got a home in Ireland, which I did have in those days, by the sea, writing books. You're obviously just kind of easing your way out. That was a terrible chill to me, because only about a week earlier, my wife had said, I think I'm pregnant. And I realized that I was going to have another 20 years ahead of me of bills for electronic games of which I had no concept, and weird clothing, etc., and that I was going to have to work for the BBC for another 2 decades. And the idea of sort of having a quiet, nice time by the sea in Ireland didn't really enter into that. So, fortunately, they've kept me on, but whether they realise that I'm in this for the long haul, I'm not sure.
I think they've twigged that now, John.
Do you think? Yeah. Well, I've got another 15 years that I've got to be earning.
We hope you don't become a solicitor. I'm sure everyone's going to rush home and...
Yeah, I'm sorry to have rattled on so long.
No, I was going to say they're going to go home and search their atlas for fuck me in Vietnam now.
PH, it's PH, PHUOC.
A few thanks. Thanks to David and the College of Journalism for producing this session. Thanks to Millie and the Frontline Club. Thank you for your questions. Most of all, thanks to John Simpson. Thank you.